She signed the papers without reading them because that was what 77 years of trusting her own daughters had taught her to do. By the time Eleanor Voss understood what the signature meant, the moving truck was already empty, and the house on Maple Street belonged to strangers. Her clothes sat folded in 2 suitcases by the door of a room she had not chosen, in a building that smelled of bleach and boiled chicken, and nobody had thought to ask her where she might want to go instead. But there was a place they had forgotten to sell, because they had forgotten it ever existed. 11 miles past the edge of town, behind a stand of birch trees gone wild with 30 years of silence, stood the pottery her mother built with her own 2 hands back in 1950. The county record still listed it under a name nobody living recognized. The daughters had cleared out a house. They had never once thought to clear out a memory. When Eleanor pried open that warped wooden door for the first time in decades, the hinges screamed like something startled awake, and the smell that met her was not decay. It was clay, dry, mineral, faintly sweet, exactly as she remembered it from a childhood spent barefoot on a concrete floor, while her mother shaped bowls for farmers who paid in eggs and firewood. Dust hung in the slanted light, and beneath that dust, wedged behind a loose brick in the old kiln, something had been waiting for her with a patience that outlasted everyone who had given up on this place. What she found there was never meant to stay hidden forever. It was meant to be found by someone who still remembered how to listen for it. Someone willing to get her hands dirty again. Someone her mother had trusted long before any signature, any sale, any betrayal. A letter would surface, written in a steady, careful hand. A stranger with grease-stained knuckles would arrive at her gate offering help and asking nothing in return. And slowly, the truth of what her mother had spent 40 quiet years doing for this town would begin to surface, one clue at a time. Eleanor Voss had been told she had nothing left. She had been told to be grateful for a small room and a borrowed bed and a life measured out in visiting hours. But some inheritances are not written into a will, and some homes cannot be sold out from under you because they were never really gone. They were only waiting. And on a cold morning in October, with her hands pressed flat against the door her mother once built, Eleanor was about to learn exactly how much had been left for her to find. The fall happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, on the 3rd step down from her back porch, a step Eleanor Voss had taken 10,000 times without thinking about it. Her hip gave out before her foot found the ground, and she lay there for 40 minutes in the heat before her neighbor's dog started barking loud enough that someone finally came to look. By the time the ambulance reached Maple Street, she was conscious but pale, gripping the strap of her purse like it was the only thing still hers. The hospital kept her 6 days. The rehabilitation facility kept her 11 weeks. Nobody asked her in all that time what she wanted to happen to the house. Her daughters, Patricia and Renee, came to visit twice in the first month and once in the second. They sat in the vinyl chairs by her bed and talked about insurance and physical therapy schedules, in voices that stayed carefully even, the kind of even that meant something else was being decided just out of earshot. Eleanor noticed the way Patricia's eyes moved to the window instead of to her mother's face. She noticed the folder Renee carried under her arm both times, never quite open, never quite explained. She did not ask. 77 years had taught her that some questions, once asked, could not be unasked, and some answers could not be unheard. The call came on a Thursday in October, 2 days before she was scheduled to be discharged. Patricia's voice on the phone was bright in the wrong way, the way people sound when they have rehearsed something. She used the word practical 4 times in 90 seconds. She used the word safer twice. By the end of the call, Eleanor understood that the house on Maple Street, the house her late husband Harold had paid off in 1998, the house where both her daughters had been born in the back bedroom because the roads were too icy to reach the hospital, had been sold. Closing had happened the previous Monday. The buyers were a young couple from Columbus who wanted to renovate the kitchen. "You signed the power of attorney, Mom," Renee said when Eleanor finally reached her 2 days later, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed in a paper gown. "Back in March, when you had the surgery. You don't remember signing it?" Eleanor remembered signing a great many papers that March. She had been recovering from a torn rotator cuff, groggy on pain medication, trusting the hands that placed pen after pen in front of her, because those hands belonged to her own children. She had not read every line. She had not imagined she needed to. "It was for the medical decisions," Eleanor said. "That's what you told me." "It covers more than that," Renee said. "It has to, Mom. For situations exactly like this one." The room they had arranged for her was called The Birches at Hollow Creek, a name chosen, Eleanor suspected, by someone who had never once stood near an actual birch tree. It was 400 square feet with a single window facing the parking lot, furnished with 2 pieces from her old bedroom set, and the rest unfamiliar, generic. The kind of furniture that belonged to no one in particular. The monthly cost was $1,140, a figure Patricia had mentioned with visible relief, as though the number itself were a kindness. Eleanor's pension and Harold's life insurance covered it, with $61 left over each month for anything else. She did not ask what had happened to the rest of the proceeds from the sale. She spent her first 3 days there unpacking 2 suitcases into a closet built for one person's clothes, setting a framed photograph of Harold on the windowsill, and listening to the woman in the next room cry quietly through the shared wall each night around 9 o'clock. She did not cry. She had decided somewhere between the hospital and this room that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing it, not even herself, alone in a mirror. She folded her cardigans the way her mother had taught her, sleeves first, then in thirds. She set her hairbrush at a precise angle on the dresser. Order was the only thing left that obeyed her. On the 4th day, a woman from the front office knocked and handed her a small cardboard box that had been forwarded from the old address. Inside, wrapped in a dish towel that still smelled faintly of the house, was a stack of mail the new owners had not bothered to return properly, along with a single manila envelope addressed not to Eleanor Voss, but to Ruth Calloway, her mother, dead now, 19 years. The envelope was postmarked from the county assessor's office. Eleanor sat down hard on the edge of the bed and opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside was a tax notice, brief and formal, regarding a property at the end of a road Eleanor had not driven down since she was a girl. Parcel 14, Birchfield Township. Taxes owed, $93, decades overdue, interest forgiven under some county hardship clause Eleanor didn't fully understand. The property was listed under her mother's maiden name, Ruth Calloway, and beneath that, in smaller print, a single line of description. Structure, 1 building, formerly operating as Birchfield Pottery. Eleanor read it 3 times before the words settled into something she could hold on to. Her mother's pottery. Closed since the spring of 1991. The year Eleanor had been too consumed with her own children, her own grief over Harold's first heart attack, to ask what had become of the building once the kiln went cold. She had assumed it sold. She had assumed, in the careless way a person assumes things about a chapter of life they have closed the door on, that someone else now owned the dirt and the brick and the memory of her mother's hands shaping clay at 6 in the morning before the heat came in. But the notice in her lap said otherwise. The property was still in the family. It had simply been forgotten, the way a coat is forgotten at the back of a closet, not lost, only unworn for so long that its owner stopped remembering it existed. That night, Eleanor lay in the narrow bed at the Birches at Hollow Creek and did the kind of arithmetic that does not appear on any worksheet. $61 a month. No house. No husband. 2 daughters who had decided, somewhere along the line, that their mother's comfort and their mother's consent were two different things, and that only one of them mattered. And 11 miles outside of town, behind a stand of birch trees nobody had cleared in 30 years, stood a building that still, according to a county clerk in a back office, technically belonged to her. She did not sleep much that night. She did not need to. By the time the gray light came through the parking lot window, she had already decided where she was going, and she had already decided that this time she would not be asking anyone's permission. The birches at Hollow Creek ran on a schedule designed by people who had never lived inside one. Breakfast at 7, medication rounds at 8, a mid-morning activity period that alternated between bingo and a seated stretching class led by a woman named Donna who spoke to every resident as though they were a child learning to count. Eleanor attended exactly 2 of these sessions in her first week, sitting in the back row with her arms crossed, before she decided that the cost of her dignity was not worth the free coffee. She began staying in her room instead. The door cracked just enough to hear the hallway without inviting anyone into it. The walls were thin enough that she could track the entire facility's day by sound. Alone, the squeak of the medication cart, the particular cough of the man 2 doors down, the woman next to her crying softly each night at 9. She called Patricia on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the tax notice arrived, and asked plainly what had happened to the money from the sale of the house. There was a pause on the line long enough that Eleanor could hear a television playing somewhere behind her daughter, a game show host asking a question nobody answered. Patricia explained, in the patient tone of someone repeating something already explained, that the proceeds had gone toward Eleanor's care costs, toward closing fees, toward an outstanding line of credit Harold had taken out years before his death, that none of them had known about until the title search turned it up. Eleanor asked to see the paperwork. Patricia said she would email it, though Eleanor did not own a computer, and had not owned one since Harold died, and both of them knew it. "You could just tell me the number," Eleanor said. "How much was left, after everything?" "It's complicated, Mom," Patricia said. "There's not really a clean number. There's $61 in my account a month," Eleanor said. "That's a fairly clean number." Patricia did not answer that. She said she had to go, that Renee would call later in the week, and the line went quiet in the particular way a phone goes quiet when someone is hung up gently, trying not to seem like they are running from something. Renee did not call later in the week. Eleanor spent those days doing what she had always done when the world refused to give her information, which was to gather what scraps she could find and lay them out like pieces of a quilt, looking for the pattern underneath. She asked one of the aides, a young woman named Carla who seemed to actually see her rather than simply process her, whether the facility had a computer Eleanor might borrow for 20 minutes. Carla found her one in the small library off the dining hall, a beige machine that ran slow and groaned through every search, and showed her how to type into the white box at the top. Eleanor searched her mother's name first. Ruth Calloway returned almost nothing, a handful of old newspaper archive snippets requiring a subscription she did not have. A faded mention in a county historical society newsletter from 1976 praising local craftspeople. Ruth's name listed 3rd among 6. She searched Birchfield Pottery next and found a single black and white photograph, scanned from some old promotional flyer, showing a low brick building with a wooden sign out front and a woman in an apron standing beside a kiln. Her hair tied back, her hands resting on her hips in a posture Eleanor recognized instantly, because she had inherited that exact stance herself. The weight settled into one hip, chin slightly raised. A woman daring the world to tell her she couldn't do something. She sat with that photograph on the screen for a long time, long enough that Carla came back twice to check whether she needed help. Eleanor did not need help. She needed time, and the screen gave her that, 20 silent minutes in which her mother existed again. Briefly, in a place that was not a hospital bed in 1991, not a funeral home in 1991, not a folded flag of memory packed away because grief had needed somewhere to put it. Ruth Calloway had built something with her own hands in 1950, in a county that had not, as far as Eleanor could remember, made things especially easy for a widow with 2 acres and a kiln and no husband to vouch for her credit. And somewhere along the way, the building had simply stopped being spoken of. That evening, Eleanor opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one she had not yet unpacked, and pulled out the small fireproof box that had survived 3 moves and 1 house fire scare in 1983. Inside were the things she had decided over the years were worth keeping, no matter what else got left behind. Harold's watch stopped at the time he had died, 4:17 in the afternoon. A lock of hair from each of her daughters tied with thread gone brittle. And at the bottom, beneath a folded American flag from her own father's service, a small stack of letters tied with kitchen twine. Her mother's handwriting on the top envelope, addressed simply to whoever finds this. Eleanor had never opened it. She remembered finding the bundle among her mother's things after the funeral, remembered some instinct telling her it was not yet time, that grief that fresh had no business reading words meant to be received with a clear head. She had packed it away instead, into box after box, through every move that followed, never quite forgetting it existed, never quite ready to open it either. She held it now under the weak light of the bedside lamp, feeling the weight of paper that had waited 19 years for someone to be ready. She did not open it that night. Instead, she set it on the dresser beside Harold's photograph and made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like something finally arriving at its proper time. In the morning, she would ask Carla about the bus schedule. The county still ran one, a small white shuttle that looped out past the old grain elevator and the highway exit toward Birchfield Township twice a day, mostly for residents without cars who needed groceries or doctor's appointments in the next town over. Eleanor had $61 in her account and a fare that cost $3 each way. She had a tax notice with an address on it. She had a photograph of a woman standing with her hand on her hip in front of a building that, as far as the county was concerned, still belonged to the family. She slept better that night than she had in 11 weeks. Not because anything had been resolved, but because for the first time since the fall on the back porch step, she had somewhere to go that was entirely her own to choose. In the morning, she packed a small canvas bag, the kind she used to carry for grocery runs, with a flashlight borrowed from the facility's maintenance closet, a bottle of water, the manila tax envelope, and her mother's letter, still unopened, still tied in twine. She told Carla only that she had an errand to run and asked almost as an afterthought whether the shuttle driver would mind a stop a little past the official route. Carla said she'd ask. Eleanor said that would be kind of her, and meant it, and stood by the front doors at 9:30 the next morning, with her coat buttoned to the throat, waiting for a bus that would take her somewhere nobody had thought to ask her if she wanted to go, because for the first time in months, nobody needed to ask. She was simply going. The shuttle driver was a heavy-set man named Gary, who had worked the Hollow Creek route for 11 years and had developed, in that time, a habit of narrating the landscape for passengers who rarely asked him to. He pointed out the old Methodist church that had closed in 2006, the field that used to grow tobacco before the co-op went under, the gas station at the county line that still sold worms and night crawlers out of a cooler by the register. Eleanor sat near the front, her canvas bag on her lap, and watched the town fall away behind them in pieces. First the strip malls, then the gas stations, then finally the long stretches of fence line and harvested cornfield that meant they had crossed into the township proper. The road was smooth asphalt for the first 9 miles. She watched the center line the way some people watch a fire. Birchfield Pottery, Gary repeated, when she gave him the address scrawled on the back of the tax notice. Been a long time since anybody asked me for that one. He slowed the bus where County Road 9 split off from the main highway, a narrow lane marked by a leaning green sign half swallowed by sumac. This is about as close as the regular route goes. Rest is gravel, and the township stopped maintaining it some time back. You sure this is where you're headed? Eleanor said she was sure. Gary studied her for a moment in the rearview mirror, the kind of look a person gives someone they suspect doesn't have a ride home, then pulled the bus onto the gravel anyway, telling her it was no trouble, that he had 20 minutes built into the schedule and nowhere better to spend them. The asphalt gave way to gravel with a change in sound first, the smooth hum of tires replaced by a steady crunch and pop, gravel kicking up against the wheel wells. The road narrowed as it went, fence lines pressing closer on either side, fields giving way to scrub brush and then to a thin stand of trees that thickened the farther they traveled. Eleanor watched the world close in around the windows, the way it used to when her father drove her out this same direction as a girl, before the trees had grown so tall, before the road had worn down to something closer to memory than infrastructure. Gary slowed the bus to a crawl over a washed-out section where the gravel had given way entirely to packed dirt and root. "This is as far as I can take her," Gary said, easing to a stop where the lane curved out of sight around a stand of birch. "Road's not graded past here. You want me to wait?" Eleanor told him no, that she didn't know how long she'd be, and that she would call the facility for a ride back if it came to that. Gary did not look entirely convinced, but he wrote down a number on a gas station receipt and handed it to her anyway. Told her it was his cell, that she should call if the walk back got to be too much. She thanked him and stepped down off the bus into air that smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt. The kind of smell that does not exist within city limits. The walk from there was perhaps a quarter mile. The dirt lane curving twice before the trees opened into a clearing. She recognized the instant she saw it, though she had not stood in this spot in over 30 years. The building sat low and long against the tree line, brick the color of rust gone dull, a roof line sagging gently in the middle the way an old barn sags, not from collapse, but from decades of simply being asked to hold itself up. Windows along the front were boarded in places, broken in others, and a wooden sign that had once read Birchfield Pottery in hand-painted letters hung at an angle from a single remaining bracket. The paint faded to a ghost of its original blue. Vines had taken half the south wall. A young maple had rooted itself directly against the foundation, growing up through a gap where the porch steps used to be. Eleanor stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, taking the place in the way a person takes in a face they have not seen since childhood, looking for what has changed, and what impossibly has not. The neglect was total and unmistakable, the kind that accumulates only through true abandonment, weather and animals and time working uncontested for 30 years. And yet, as her eyes moved across the ruin of it, one detail snagged and held, refusing to fit the pattern of the rest. A thin curl of gray smoke rose from the chimney at the building's east end, faint but unmistakable against the pale sky. The kind of smoke that comes from a fire someone tends, not one that starts on its own. She stood very still and watched it for a full minute, the way a person watches something they suspect might vanish if they move too quickly. The smoke did not vanish. It rose steady and thin, dispersing into the cold autumn air above the trees, evidence of a fire that had no business existing in a building the county listed as abandoned, on a parcel nobody had paid taxes on in years, behind a road so overgrown that even the postal service had apparently given up trying to reach it. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two, the way both feelings often do when a person has been disappointed too many times to trust either one fully. She adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder and started across the clearing, her boots sinking slightly into ground still soft from a rain 2 days before. The grass had grown knee-high in places, gone gold and brittle with the season, and she moved through it slowly, mindful of her hip, mindful of the uneven ground hidden beneath. A row of old clay pots, cracked and weathered, sat lined along what had once been a front walkway, half buried now in fallen leaves. The kind of thing nobody bothers to clear away because nobody believes anyone is coming back to need them. She counted 11 pots before she reached the door, an old habit of her mother's she hadn't known she'd inherited, counting things to keep her hands busy while her mind worked through something larger. The door itself was wood, gray with weather, a heavy iron latch rusted nearly solid. A padlock hung from a hasp beside it, but the hasp had pulled half free from rotted wood, leaving the lock dangling uselessly, more suggestion than barrier. Eleanor reached the threshold and stopped there, her hand resting flat against the door's surface, feeling the grain of it beneath her palm, weathered smooth in places, splintered in others. Somewhere behind that door, a fire burned in a building nobody was supposed to be tending. Somewhere behind that door was the last place her mother had ever truly belonged. She drew a breath, steadied her weight against her cane, and pushed. The door gave with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the building's bones, hinges shrieking against 30 years of rust before settling into a low, reluctant swing. Eleanor stepped over the threshold into air that struck her immediately, not as the staleness she expected, but as something closer to memory. Dry clay dust, mineral and faintly sweet, mixed now with the unmistakable smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere toward the back. Sunlight cut through gaps in the boarded windows in long, dust-laden bars, catching the particles she had stirred just by walking inside. The main room stretched longer than she remembered, lined on one side with shelving that had partially collapsed under decades of weather seeping through a damaged roof. A kickwheel sat near the center of the floor, draped in a tarp gone gray with grime, exactly where her mother used to sit each morning with her hair pinned back and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She moved through the space slowly, her cane finding solid ground before she trusted her weight to it, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Tools hung along a pegboard on the far wall, rusted but still recognizable. Wire clay cutters, wooden ribs worn smooth from handling, a heavy rolling pin used for slab work. A workbench ran along the east side, its surface scarred with decades of cuts and stains, and bolted to one end was a vise Eleanor's father had installed himself, the rubber grip on its handle worn down to bare metal from 40 years of use before he passed. She ran her fingers along the bench's edge, feeling grooves she suddenly remembered tracing as a child, waiting for her mother to finish a piece before they walked home together in the fading light. Nothing in the room had been touched in a way that suggested anyone lived here, and yet near the back wall, that thin curl of smoke kept rising from a small wood stove, fed, clearly, by someone. She found the source a moment later, a stack of split firewood neatly arranged beside the stove, far too orderly to belong to neglect, and a kettle resting on top, still faintly warm to the touch. Eleanor stood with her hand near the kettle's handle, feeling the residual heat, and felt the strange tightening in her chest return. Not fear exactly, but the unsettled awareness of sharing a space with someone unseen. She called out, her voice rough from disuse, asking if anyone was there. No answer came, only the settling creak of old timber and the distant call of a crow somewhere beyond the trees. She decided, after a long moment, that whoever tended this fire was not present now, and that the mystery of it would have to wait its turn behind the more immediate task in front of her. The kiln stood at the building's far end, a brick structure nearly her own height, its iron door hanging slightly ajar on a hinge gone stiff with rust. Eleanor approached it the way a person approaches something half-remembered from a dream, recognizing the shape of it before her mind caught up with the details, the particular pattern of brick her mother had laid herself with help from a neighbor in the spring of 1951. She set her bag down on the workbench and pulled out the flashlight Carla had found for her, clicking it on against the gloom gathering near the kiln's base. One brick near the bottom course sat slightly proud of the others, its mortar joint thinner, the color a shade lighter than its neighbors, as though it had been removed and reset more than once over the years. She knelt, slow and careful, bracing one hand against the kiln's cold brick face, and worked her fingers into the gap around that single loose brick. It resisted at first, decades of dried mortar dust gripping it stubborn against her efforts, and she found a flathead screwdriver among the tools on the pegboard, its handle wrapped in brittle electrical tape, and used it as a pry bar, working the blade into the seam and leaning her weight against it. Her shoulder ached. Her knees protested against the cold concrete floor beneath her. She kept working anyway, the way she had learned to keep working through pain decades ago, raising 2 daughters mostly alone during the years Harold traveled for his job, because stopping had never once made the task easier. The brick finally gave with a grinding shift and a puff of old mortar dust, sliding free into her waiting hands. Behind it sat a small recessed cavity, clearly built into the kiln structure on purpose rather than worn there by accident, lined with a sheet of tin gone dull with age. Inside, wrapped in a square of oiled cloth that had kept the worst of the damp away, sat an old coffee tin, its label long faded past reading. Eleanor lifted it free with both hands, feeling its weight, modest but real, and set it on the workbench beside her bag. Her hands were not entirely steady as she worked the lid loose, the metal protesting with a soft, tearing pop before finally releasing. Inside, folded neatly, were bills totaling $211, mostly worn 1s and 5s that suggested decades of small, careful saving rather than a single deposit. Beneath the money sat a small brass key, old-fashioned, the kind meant for a padlock or a cabinet rather than any modern door, its teeth cut in a pattern Eleanor didn't recognize. There was no note tucked alongside it, no explanation, only the money and the key and the silent fact of their having been hidden here on purpose, sealed behind brick and mortar in a building everyone else had assumed was empty. Eleanor sat back on her heels, the coffee tin in her lap, and allowed herself, for the first time since the fall on the porch step 3 months before, something close to a smile. She understood, sitting there in the dust and the slanted afternoon light, that this small cache was not the end of whatever her mother had left behind, but only its opening note, a door propped just wide enough to suggest a much larger room beyond it. The key in her palm fit nothing she could see in this workshop. No cabinet, no drawer, no padlock hanging loose anywhere in sight. Somewhere on this property, or perhaps somewhere beyond it, there was a lock waiting for this particular key, and Eleanor intended to find it. She wrapped the tin carefully back in its oiled cloth, tucked it into her canvas bag alongside the unopened letter still bound in twine, and rose slowly to her feet, brushing kiln dust from her coat. Outside, the light had begun shifting toward late afternoon, gold deepening at the edges, and Eleanor realized with a small jolt that she had lost track of how long she'd been inside. She gathered her bag, took one last look around the workshop that had once been her mother's whole world, and stepped back out into the clearing, the door swinging shut behind her with a groan that sounded, this time, less like protest and more like something settling back into place. As she crossed the overgrown yard toward the dirt lane, a sound reached her from somewhere off to the east. An engine, low and unhurried, the particular rattle of an old truck working its way down a road that nobody, by all rights, should have any reason left to drive. The truck that rounded the bend was a faded green Ford from somewhere in the late 70s, its bed loaded with split firewood and a coil of garden hose, the engine running rough in the particular way of a vehicle that has been kept alive far longer than its manufacturer ever intended. It slowed as it reached the clearing, gravel popping under tires worn nearly bald, and came to a stop a respectful distance from where Eleanor stood. The driver's door opened with a creak that rivaled the building's own, and a man climbed down slowly, favoring his left knee. A man somewhere past 70 with a gray beard trimmed close and a flannel shirt patched at one elbow with a square of denim sewn on by hand. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment before he looked at the building behind her, and something in his face shifted, recognition dawning slow, like a man working out a math problem he hadn't expected to need again. "You're Ruth's girl," he said finally. It was not quite a question. "Eleanor, you used to ride your bicycle out past my place on the way here. Must be 50 years back now." Eleanor studied him in turn, searching for the boy he must have been somewhere beneath the beard and the weathered skin, and found, after a moment, the faint outline of a memory. A neighbor boy a few years older who used to help haul cordwood for the kiln, in exchange for whatever Ruth could spare from the register. "Walter," she said slowly. "Walter Pruitt's boy, from the dairy farm 2 over." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that comes easier to a man once he's been properly remembered. "Just Walter now," he said. "Dairy's long gone. I do kiln work these days mostly. Repairs mostly for the folks up at the community center in town." He explained, standing there in the gold light of late afternoon, that he had been tending the wood stove inside for nearly 6 years, not out of any official arrangement, but because he had simply never been able to stand the idea of the building going fully cold. He came by twice a week when his knee allowed it, checked the roof after storms, kept the worst of the damp from setting into the brick. He had known Ruth Calloway most of his life, he said, had learned more about firing a kiln from watching her work than from any class he ever took later on. When she passed in 1991 and nobody came to claim the building properly, he had simply kept showing up, the way a person keeps watering a neighbor's garden after they've gone on a trip that seems to have no clear end date. "County never came after the taxes hard," Walter said, settling against the tailgate of his truck. "Small parcel. No real value to anybody. Townships got bigger fish. I figured someday somebody in the family would come looking. Took longer than I figured." Eleanor told him, briefly and without much elaboration, what had happened to the house on Maple Street, to the power of attorney, to the 11 weeks in rehabilitation, and the room at the Birches at Hollow Creek that cost more than her pension could comfortably carry. Walter listened without interrupting, his arms crossed, his jaw working slightly the way a man's does when he is holding back an opinion out of politeness. When she finished, he only nodded once, slow, and said that families could be a strange business, and left it there. The way men of his generation often left things they didn't feel entitled to comment further on. He walked with her back inside, his boots sure on the uneven floor in a way that suggested long familiarity, and pointed out small repairs he'd made over the years almost as an afterthought. A patched section of roof above the kiln, a replaced board on the workbench, the propane line he'd capped off safely after finding it corroded through 2 winters back. Eleanor mentioned the loose brick, the coffee tin, the $211 and the small brass key that fit nothing she'd found so far. Walter's eyebrows rose slightly at that, though he didn't seem entirely surprised. "Ruth was careful," he said. "Careful the way people get when they've had to be careful their whole lives. Wouldn't put it past her to have more than one place tucked away." He looked around the workshop slowly, as though seeing it freshly through the lens of that possibility. Before he left, Walter pulled a battered toolbox from the bed of his truck, the kind with a dozen small drawers and a top tray worn shiny from decades of handling, and set it on the workbench without ceremony. "Figured you'd be needing tools sooner or later if you're planning on staying out here some," he said. "Got doubles of most of this anyway." Eleanor opened her mouth to ask what she owed him, reaching instinctively for the canvas bag where the coffee tin sat, and Walter held up one weathered hand before she could finish the thought. "Don't," he said simply. "Your mother fed half this township through the worst years without ever once asking for a thing back. I'm not about to start charging interest on that now." Eleanor did not argue further. She had learned, somewhere in 77 years of living, that some kindnesses were better received in silence than questioned too closely, and that pressing a man like Walter to explain his generosity would only embarrass them both. She thanked him instead, plain and brief, and he nodded once and said it was nothing, the way men like him always said it was nothing when it plainly was not. He told her he'd be back Thursday to check the stove, same as always, and that she ought to think about getting the roof properly looked at before the next hard rain, before the damage spread further than it already had. As his truck rumbled back down the dirt lane and out of sight beyond the birches, Eleanor stood alone again in the clearing, the toolbox heavy in her hands, the small brass key still tucked safe in her coat pocket where she'd moved it earlier without quite deciding to. The light had gone properly gold now, the kind of late afternoon light that made even ruin look gentle, softening the broken windows and the sagging roofline into something closer to dignity than decay. She thought of her mother standing in this same clearing, hands on her hips, daring the world to tell her she couldn't manage alone. She thought of Walter, a boy grown old, quietly tending a fire in a building that wasn't his, because some debts, the real ones, never show up on any ledger anyone bothers to keep. She gathered her bag in the toolbox and started back down the lane toward the spot where Gary's bus had left her, the brass key resting cold and certain against her chest with every step. Eleanor returned to Birchfield Pottery 3 days later, on a Sunday morning that Carla had arranged to cover with an early shift change so she could borrow the facility's small sedan for a few hours instead of waiting on Gary's shuttle. The drive felt different in daylight. She controlled herself, the gravel and dirt of County Road 9 less like a closing trap and more like a path she was choosing to walk again on purpose. She parked where the lane grew too narrow for the car and carried Walter's toolbox the rest of the way on foot, her hip aching by the time the building came into view, but her steps steady, certain, the steps of a woman who had decided something and intended to follow it through. Smoke rose again from the chimney, faint as before, and she found herself smiling at the sight of it now instead of startled by it. Inside, she set the toolbox on the workbench and pulled the small brass key from her coat pocket, turning it over in her fingers under the gray morning light filtering through the boarded windows. The teeth were cut in an old pattern, narrow and slightly curved, nothing like the modern padlocks sold at any hardware store. She walked the workshop slowly, checking every cabinet and drawer she could find, the shelving along the back wall, a battered filing cabinet half collapsed under roof damage, a wooden chest near the kiln that turned out to hold nothing but cracked glaze jars gone solid with age. None of the locks matched. She sat down on an overturned crate, the key resting in her open palm, and made herself think the way her mother had always taught her to think when a problem refused to yield. Slowly, and from the beginning. If you hide a small notice in one wall, her mother used to say about everything from preserving jars to bank accounts, you don't put the big one in plain sight either. Eleanor rose and walked the building's perimeter again, this time looking not for locks but for anything that seemed deliberately placed, deliberately disguised. She found it near the back corner, behind a stack of old wooden pallets that had clearly been arranged, not merely abandoned, to obscure a low door set into what she had always assumed was solid foundation wall. The door was barely 3 feet high, built for crawling rather than walking, its hinges newer than the rest of the building's hardware, and at its center sat a small iron padlock, rusted but intact. Her hands shook slightly as she fit the brass key into the lock, more from anticipation than from the cold settling into the unheated corner of the room. The key turned with a stiff, grinding resistance, then gave, the padlock springing open after 30-some years of patient waiting. Eleanor pulled the hasp free and tugged the small door outward, the wood swollen and reluctant, until it finally yielded with a soft groan and a puff of dry, undisturbed air. Behind it lay a crawl space barely large enough for a grown woman to enter on hands and knees, and inside that crawl space, wrapped carefully in waxed canvas and stacked with obvious, deliberate care, sat a wooden crate roughly the size of a small footlocker. She knelt at the opening for a long moment before reaching in, bracing one hand against the cold stone foundation, feeling for the first time in this entire process something close to reverence rather than mere curiosity. The crate slid free with effort, heavier than she expected, and she dragged it out into the workshop's better light, setting it on the floor and kneeling beside it despite the protest in her knees. The waxed canvas had done its work well, keeping decades of damp at bay, and beneath it the wood of the crate itself was dry, sound, marked along one edge with her mother's handwriting in faded grease pencil. For whoever still believes in this place. This is the part of the video where it would mean a great deal if you tap that subscribe button so you never miss what Ruth Calloway left behind, and the quiet kind of justice that was still working its way toward her daughter after 30 long years. Eleanor worked the crate's lid free with the flathead screwdriver from Walter's toolbox, the nails giving one by one with small, reluctant pops. Inside, nestled in straw gone brittle but still protective, sat a dozen pieces of finished stoneware, bowls and pitchers glazed in deep blues and earthy ochres, each one wrapped individually in cloth, clearly chosen and packed by someone who understood exactly what she was preserving. Beneath the pottery lay a stack of leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with her mother's small, careful handwriting, columns of numbers and names stretching back decades. And tucked beneath the ledgers, in a sealed manila envelope gone soft with age, sat a single bank passbook from a credit union Eleanor vaguely remembered from her childhood, the kind of small local institution that had likely been absorbed by a larger bank years ago. She opened the passbook with fingers that had gone properly unsteady now, scanning entries that spanned from the early 1960s through a final deposit dated just 2 months before her mother's death in 1991. The deposits were modest individually, $10 here, $22 there. Occasionally larger sums following what the ledger beside it suggested were good seasons for pottery sales. But they accumulated with the patient consistency of someone who had never once touched the principal for her own comfort. The final balance, recorded in her mother's own hand on the passbook's last entry, read $61,400. Eleanor sat back hard against the crate, the passbook trembling slightly in her grip, and did not move for a long while, the morning light shifting slowly across the workshop floor around her. She understood, sitting there amid straw and stoneware and decades of careful arithmetic, that this was not simply an inheritance in the ordinary sense, money set aside for a daughter the way a parent might naturally provide. The ledgers told a different story, one she had not yet fully read, but already sensed in its shape. Names she half recognized from childhood, small notations beside each one that looked less like sales records and more like a private accounting of who in this county had needed help, and when, and how much. Her mother had not simply made pottery and sold it. She had built something quieter and larger than that, something Eleanor was only now beginning to understand the edges of, sitting alone in a forgotten workshop with $61,400 and a stack of ledgers that promised to explain exactly why. She closed the passbook carefully and set it back among the ledgers, then turned her attention to the unopened letter still resting in her canvas bag, the one tied in kitchen twine, addressed to whoever finds this. The light through the boarded windows had shifted fully into late morning now, warm enough that Eleanor felt no urgency to leave, no clock pressing against her the way the facility's schedule always did. She gathered the letter into her lap, untied the twine with hands that had gone steady again, and unfolded the first page of her mother's careful, slanted handwriting, the words waiting 19 years for a reader who was at last, finally ready. The letter ran to 11 pages, written in a hand that grew slightly less steady toward the end, as though her mother had returned to it across several sittings rather than composing it all in one breath. Eleanor read the date at the top first, March 3rd, 1991, 6 weeks before the heart attack that took Ruth Calloway in her sleep, in the same back bedroom where both her granddaughters had been born. The paper had gone soft and faintly yellow with age, but the ink had held, dark and certain, and Eleanor settled herself more fully against the crate. The morning light warm enough now through the gaps in the boarded windows that she did not feel the cold of the workshop floor beneath her. "Dear whoever finds this," the letter began, "and I expect, if I've done this right, that it's you, Eleanor. Though I won't pretend to know how many years stand between my writing it and your reading it. I am 71 years old as I write this, and my heart has been telling me things lately that I don't much care to listen to. So I am putting down on paper what I never quite managed to say out loud while I had the chance. You were always the one who asked the fewest questions about this place, even as a girl, and I used to think that meant you didn't much care for it. I understand now it meant you trusted me enough not to need the answers yet. I started this pottery in the spring of 1950 with $11 and a wheel your grandfather left behind," your mother continued, the handwriting steadying now into the rhythm of someone who had clearly rehearsed these particular words many times in her head before ever setting pen to paper. "Your father had been gone 3 years by then, and the bank in town would not so much as speak to a widow about a loan, so I built what I built with my own hands and whatever I could trade for. The first winter I sold bowls for eggs and firewood because nobody in this township had cash to spare, and somewhere in the middle of all that scraping by, I made myself a promise. I told myself that if I ever got ahead, even a little, I would never let another family in this county go without the way we nearly did. The ledgers you've likely already found will tell you the rest of it better than I can explain here." The letter went on, the handwriting growing smaller as if to fit more onto each page. "Every name in those books is someone who came to me over the years needing something they couldn't ask anyone else for. A roof patched, a doctor's bill covered, a young mother needing formula money before her husband found work again. I never told a soul where the help came from. People accept charity easier when they don't have to know whose pity they're swallowing, and I never wanted pity attached to a single dollar of it. I wanted it to feel like luck, like the world simply turning kind for once, because that's the only kind of help that doesn't cost a person their dignity." Eleanor paused here, setting the pages briefly in her lap, her hand pressed flat against her chest in the quiet way she had of holding herself together when something threatened to come undone. She thought of Walter refusing payment for the toolbox 3 days before, of his words about her mother feeding half the township through the worst years, and understood now the precise shape of the debt he had been repaying without ever naming it. She thought of the photograph she'd found on the library computer, her mother's hand resting on her hip, daring the world. She picked the letter back up and continued reading, her thumb pressed gently against the edge of the page. "I am not telling you this so you'll think well of me," the letter continued, "though I won't lie and say I'd mind it. I am telling you because the money in that account is not really mine to leave you as an ordinary inheritance, not entirely. Some of it is yours by right, plain and simple, the daughter's share any mother would want her child to have. But a portion of it I hope you'll consider keeping this place open for, the way I always meant to, before my hands started shaking too badly to trust them with the wheel. There is no shame in selling it if that's what you need to do. I only ask that you not do it without first standing inside these walls and deciding for yourself what they're worth to you. Your father used to say a thing was finished," the letter read on, "when it could hold weight without cracking, whether that meant a bowl or a marriage or a person. I have tried my whole life to be the kind of finished he meant, steady enough to hold other people's weight without breaking under it, and I believe, watching you grow into the woman you became, that you carry that same steadiness in you, whether you've had cause to use it yet or not. You were always slower to anger than your sister, slower to speak, quicker to notice what other people needed before they asked for it. That is not weakness, Eleanor, whatever this world has tried to tell you about women who give more than they take. That is the rarest kind of strength there is." The final page grew shorter, the handwriting looser, as though her mother had sensed the letter needed an ending and was reluctant to give it one. I don't know what trouble life will have handed you by the time you read this, the closing lines read. But I trust that whatever it is, you found your way back here looking for something. And I hope what you found was more than just an old building and some money in a coffee tin. I hope you found a reminder that you come from people who knew how to build something lasting out of almost nothing, and that you are entirely capable of doing the same, however little you may have to start with. All my love, always, your mother, Ruth Calloway. March 3rd, 1991. Eleanor sat motionless for a long while after the final line, the letter resting open in her lap. The workshop silent except for the faint settling creak of old timber and the distant call of a crow somewhere past the trees. She did not cry, not in any dramatic sense, only pressed the back of one hand briefly against her eyes, a single quiet gesture, and then folded the pages carefully back along their original creases, the way a person folds something they intend to keep close for a long while yet. She looked around the workshop slowly, at the kick wheel still draped in its tarp, at the kiln standing cold and patient at the room's far end, at the crate of stoneware and ledgers beside her on the floor. For the first time since the fall on the porch step 3 months before, Eleanor Voss understood, with a clarity that settled into her chest like something finally fitting back into place, exactly what she intended to do next. Word traveled faster in Birchfield Township than Eleanor had anticipated, the way it always did in places small enough that one person's business eventually became everyone's. By the second week of November, she had moved out of the birches at Hollow Creek and into the small back room of the Pottery itself, a space her mother had once used for storage and that Walter helped her clear and insulate well enough for a camp stove and a cot, while the larger question of the building's future was sorted out. She had not yet decided whether to reopen the kiln in any formal sense, but she had decided, firmly, that she would not sell, and somehow that decision had reached ears she had not expected it to reach. The man who knocked on the workshop door on a Thursday afternoon introduced himself as Dale Pruitt. No relation to Walter, he clarified quickly, before she'd even asked, with a smile that arrived a beat too smoothly for the question to have been entirely unrehearsed. Dale Pruitt wore a quilted vest over a checked flannel shirt, the kind of clothing chosen to suggest rural ease while still managing to look as though it had been purchased that morning from a catalog. He carried a leather folio under one arm and spoke in the unhurried, agreeable tone of a man accustomed to being trusted on site. He represented, he explained, a small group of investors interested in converting rural properties like this one into what he called heritage retail spaces, gift shops and tasting rooms designed to draw weekend travelers off the interstate. He had done his homework, he said, mentioning the parcel number, the tax history, even Ruth Calloway's name with a familiarity that made Eleanor's jaw tighten slightly, though she kept her face even. "I can offer you $34,000, Dale said, setting the folio on the workbench and opening it to a page already filled in with figures and a signature line. "Cash, quick closing, no repairs needed on your end. I know that's not what the land's technically worth on paper, but considering the back taxes and the condition of the structure, I think you'll find it's a fair number for someone in your position." Eleanor looked at the figure for a long moment, then closed the folio gently with 2 fingers, the gesture quiet but unmistakable. "I appreciate you driving out," she said, "but the building isn't for sale." Dale's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes recalibrated, the look of a man adjusting his approach rather than abandoning it. "I understand sentiment," he said, his voice softening into something meant to sound sympathetic. "But I'd be careful if I were you about the back taxes on a place like this. County's been lenient so far, but lenience has a way of running out, especially once a parcel starts attracting outside interest. Wouldn't want you to lose the place for nothing after coming all this way to find it." The threat was so gently delivered that it took Eleanor a moment to recognize it fully for what it was, wrapped as it was in the language of concern rather than menace. She told him, evenly, that she would manage her own taxes, and thanked him again for his time, and watched him gather his folio and walk back to a clean white truck parked at the edge of the clearing. She called the county assessor's office the following morning, using the facility's library computer one last time before her things were fully moved, and learned that the hardship clause covering the overdue taxes remained valid, that nothing about her ownership was currently at risk, and that Dale Pruitt's company had, in fact, made inquiries about the parcel twice in the past 18 months. The clerk, a tired-sounding woman named Donna Ferris, mentioned almost in passing that similar offers had gone out to several elderly property owners along County Road 9 and the roads beyond it, always cash, always quick, always pitched to people whose circumstances made a fast, simple answer sound tempting. Eleanor thanked her and hung up with a steadiness that surprised her, the particular calm of a woman who has just confirmed that the threat in front of her, while real, was not unbeatable. She drove into town that same afternoon and spoke with a young attorney named Marcus Webb, recommended by Carla, whose office sat above the hardware store and who agreed to review the original power of attorney document for a fee of $200, payable from the coffee tin's remaining funds. Marcus read through the paperwork twice, his brow tightening, and explained that while the document had likely been valid when signed, its scope had almost certainly been misapplied to the sale of the Maple Street house, a property the document did not explicitly authorize anyone to dispose of. It was not, he cautioned, a guaranteed case, but it was a real one, and he agreed to file the necessary motions on her behalf, the first formal step toward holding her daughters accountable for what they had done. It was on her way back from town, the borrowed sedan rattling over the washed-out section of Dirt Lane, that Eleanor first noticed the boy sitting on the front steps of the Pottery, a young man no older than 20, his backpack worn thin at the seams, his boots held together with duct tape at the toe. He stood quickly when he saw her car, the wary posture of someone who expected to be told to leave before he'd had the chance to explain himself. His name, he told her, was Casey Doyle, and he'd been walking the county roads for 3 days after losing his job at a feedlot 2 towns over, sleeping in barns when he could find them unlocked, looking for any kind of work that might feed him through the winter. He had seen smoke from the chimney, and hoped, he admitted, that whoever lived there might have odd jobs needing doing. Eleanor stood beside her car for a long moment, studying him, the thin coat, the careful, polite way he kept his eyes down rather than meeting hers directly, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been turned away from enough doors to expect it as the default answer. She thought of herself 11 weeks before, sitting in a hospital bed with nowhere to go and nobody asking what she wanted. She thought of her mother's letter, of decades of names in a ledger, of a promise made over $11 and a borrowed wheel in the spring of 1950. "There's a wood pile that needs splitting," she said finally, "and a roof that needs patching before the next hard rain. I can't pay much, but there's a cot in the back room, and I won't have you sleeping in a barn while there's a stove going warm 20 feet away." Casey Doyle did not say yes right away. He only nodded, slow, the way a person nods when they've stopped expecting kindness and are still working out how to receive it without flinching. By the second week of December, the workshop had begun to look less like a ruin and more like a building that intended to keep standing. Casey Doyle proved steady with a hammer once shown the proper way to set a roofing nail, and within 10 days the worst of the leaks above the kiln had been sealed, the new shingles a slightly brighter gray than the old weathered patches around them. Walter came by most Thursdays as promised, bringing tools and occasionally a casserole dish from his late wife's old recipes, and the two men worked well together in the easy, mostly silent way of people who measure trust in completed tasks rather than conversation. Eleanor spent her mornings going through her mother's ledgers page by page, cross-referencing names against the county phone book Donna Ferris had photocopied for her, and the list of recipients grew longer with each session, families she remembered faintly. families she had never known at all. Marcus Webb's motion regarding the power of attorney was heard in county court on a gray Tuesday in early December, a brief, unglamorous proceeding that nonetheless ended with a judge ordering Patricia and Renee to disclose the full accounting of the Maple Street sale proceeds, along with a finding that the document had indeed been misapplied beyond its intended scope. The daughters did not appear in person, sending instead a terse email through their own attorney expressing willingness to settle rather than proceed further, an offer Eleanor accepted not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a tiredness with the whole business that she no longer wished to carry. The settlement, when it finally came through in January, restored a portion of the house proceeds to her, though Eleanor noted without much surprise that neither daughter ever called to apologize, only to confirm that the wire transfer had gone through correctly. Dale Pruitt's company made one final approach in mid-December, a letter this time rather than a personal visit, raising the offer to $41,000 and citing, once more, vague concerns about the property's tax status. Eleanor handed the letter to Marcus Webb without comment, and Marcus responded on her behalf with a brief note confirming the parcel's clean legal standing and respectfully declining further contact. No further letters arrived after that. Walter mentioned, weeks later, hearing through the hardware store grapevine that Dale Pruitt's company had quietly redirected its attention to a different stretch of county road entirely. The soft offers and softer threats, apparently better suited to properties whose owners had nobody standing beside them. The community gathering happened almost by accident, the way the best ones often do. Walter had mentioned to a few people at the feed store that Ruth Calloway's daughter was back out at the old Pottery fixing the place up. And within 2 weeks, word had spread enough that a small crowd assembled on a Saturday afternoon in late January, drawn less by formal invitation than by simple curiosity and old affection. They came in 2s and 3s, an elderly woman named Frances Doss, who explained, almost shyly, that Ruth had quietly paid for her husband's hospital stay back in 1978. A man named Curtis Ames, who described how Ruth's small loan had kept his family's hardware store from closing during a hard winter in 1983. Each story arrived plain and brief, told without embellishment, the way people who are not accustomed to public speaking tell the truest things they know. Eleanor stood near the kiln, now lit for the first time in 30 years. Its low orange glow warming the workshop against the January cold, and listened to story after story unfold from people who had never known each other's debts to her mother, each one assuming, until that afternoon, that their own quiet rescue had been a private matter between themselves and Ruth alone. She said little, mostly nodding, occasionally pressing the back of her hand briefly against her cheek when a particular story landed somewhere tender. Casey Doyle worked the crowd quietly, handing out mugs of coffee Walter had brewed on the camp stove, and Eleanor caught herself watching him move through the room with an ease that hadn't been there 2 months before. A young man finding, perhaps for the first time in a while, some version of solid ground beneath his feet. By late February, the workshop had a proper sign again, hand-painted by Frances Doss's granddaughter, who turned out to have a steady hand for lettering. Reading simply, Birchfield Pottery, established 1950, reopened by Eleanor Voss. The kickwheel turned again most mornings, Eleanor's hands slower on the clay than her mother's had once been, but steady. Relearning a craft her body seemed to remember even when her mind had to work to catch up. Casey Doyle stayed on through the spring, splitting his time between roof repairs and learning. Slowly, how to center clay on the wheel himself, and Eleanor never once asked him when he planned to move on, understanding, the way her mother must have understood with countless others before her, that some people simply needed somewhere to stay until staying stopped feeling temporary. On an evening in early April, with the last of the daylight going gold and soft through the workshop's now unboarded windows, Eleanor sat on the front steps with a cup of tea cooling in her hands, watching Casey stack the day's firewood against the east wall while Walter's truck rattled away down the lane after his Thursday visit. The kiln's warmth still drifted faintly through the open door behind her, mixing with the cool evening air in a way that felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly measure, entirely like home. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing as the light faded further. A young woman this time, thin coat, backpack worn at the seams, walking slow and uncertain up the dirt lane the way Casey himself had walked it months before. Eleanor set her tea down on the step beside her and rose, brushing her hands against her apron, the same gesture she realized without quite meaning to, that she had seen in an old photograph of her mother standing in this very spot decades before. She did not call out or hurry toward the stranger. She simply waited, hands on her hips, chin slightly raised, the posture of a woman daring the world to tell her she couldn't manage what came next. Some inheritances, she had come to understand, were never meant to end with a single person, but to keep moving outward, one open door at a time, for as long as someone remained willing to leave the porch light on. The young woman reached the bottom of the steps, and Eleanor said only, gently, that there was coffee inside if she wanted it, and a roof that didn't leak, and no questions that needed answering tonight.